Today's discussion is formally a virtual side event for the 2022 Borlaug Dialogue. The in-person events for the dialogue start next week on Tuesday, October 18th in Des Moines, Iowa. This side event is very much in keeping with the theme of this year's dialogue, which is coming together to feed a fragile world. As our panel discussion today will be focused on the intersections of animal protein and research and innovation with global nutrition needs and the impacts of climate change. Farm Journal Foundation has organized and sponsored this event. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that works with farmers and other stakeholders from across the global food system to educate and advocate on how innovative agriculture can solve some of the world's biggest challenges, from global hunger to malnutrition to climate change. The participants in our panel discussion today have many years of experience in their fields and understand how innovation is crucial to today's conversation. The moderator for the panel today is Sean Baker, currently the Chief Nutritionist at the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. He has more than 40 years of experience in public health, nutrition, and food security. I had the pleasure of working with Sean in his previous role at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where he was the first director of nutrition and helped dramatically increase the foundation's investments in global nutrition. Our panelists today are Ken Nobis, Dr. Mike Mcfarland, and Dr. Shirley Tarawali. Ken Nobis is a dairy farmer from Michigan who recently joined Farm Journal Foundation's Farmer Ambassador Program. He served many years as president and as a board member of the Michigan Milk Association, and also served as the vice chair of the National Milk Producers Federation. He has worked closely with Michigan State University graduate students over time who have undertaken research projects on his farm. He is a graduate of Western Michigan University and also served in the U.S. Army. Dr. Mike Mcfarland is the Executive Vice President and Chief Medical Officer for Zoetis. He has spent many years in leadership roles at Zoetis and Pfizer Animal Health, and previously spent 15 years of his career as a practicing veterinarian. He earned his undergraduate degree in animal science from Texas A&M University and his DVM degree from the College of Veterinary Medicine at Texas A&M. Dr. Shirley Tarawali serves as Assistant Director General at the Kenya-based International Livestock Research Institute, ILRI, part of the CGIAR system of international agricultural research centers, and is chair of the Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock. She has over 30 years of experience implementing and leading livestock research for development, has authored or contributed to over 100 publications, and holds a PhD in plant science from the University of London. I'm anticipating a robust discussion, and audience members should feel free to put forward questions in the chat. And should time allow, we'll try to bring those into the discussion. Thanks again to all of you for joining us today, and I will now go off video and turn things over to our moderator, Sean Baker.
Thanks so much, Katie. It's good to share the stage again with you after having worked together so closely. And it's thank you to the Farm Journal Foundation, everyone who's tuned in today. And thank you for the panelists. Even meeting with the panelists before this, I already felt I was learning so much, and I really look forward to moderating this session and everything I'm going to learn. To set the context, having worked in global nutrition for many decades, I am an optimist, so please put everything in what I'm going to say in a certain level of optimism. We had been making over the last decades progress in addressing the burden of malnutrition across the world. Not necessarily the transformational progress that's needed, but certainly it was on the right pathway. But we know our world, and I think it's the theme of this world food prize is so relevant, that our world is being buffeted by shock after shock after shock. The lingering effects of the COVID pandemic, the climate crisis, which is playing out before our eyes, for example, driving the levels of food insecurity in the Horn of Africa and the Sahel, conflicts erupting across the world. And of course, on top of this, the global shock of Russia's war on Ukraine, shocking global food prices, fertilizer and fuel having impacts on everyone. So all of our actions to buffer the world more from these shocks are more important than ever. And within that, the role of animal source foods, of meeting the nutritional needs of populations across the world and meeting their livelihood needs is incredibly important. And this panel, I think, is going to give us some insights. And to start off, I wanted to ask the first question to the panelists. And Shirley, I'll start with you, but then ask Mike and Ken you to step in just to set the stage of really outline the importance of animal source foods in meeting human nutrition needs and in securing livelihoods, particularly in low and middle income countries. So over to you, Shirley, to start us off, and then I'll pass it on to Mike and to Ken to feed into to build on your responses.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Sean, and thanks also to the Farm Journal Foundation for this great opportunity. It's a really rich discussion. It's also a very timely one. Animal source foods, meat, milk, eggs, are really essential for considerable portion of the population. For many, many people, they simply don't have enough nutritious food to eat, and having a little bit of animal source food in their diet would make a huge difference to their physical and cognitive growth and nutritional status. But when we talk about animal source foods in lower middle income countries, we're talking about much more than food. Sean, you touched on it. You touched on the aspect of livelihoods, because right across the world, animal agriculture is important for livelihoods. Probably about 1 in 6 people on the planet, in one way or another, get some livelihood benefit from animals. And probably around 500 million, or over 500 million people, are dependent on livestock for their livelihoods. It's providing food and nutrition, yes, but also income, also employment, also serves to help manage risk as a sort of insurance when you need to pay school fees. In some parts of the world, an animal is sold to manage during the drought times. So a huge range of different things that animal agriculture is important for a considerable number of people around the world. But we must also put that in the context of rising demand, right? Animal source foods are going to be increasing in demand across the world, and especially in lower middle income countries. And that increase in demand is based on there being lots more people, often with a little bit more income, that very often get spent on those meat, milk, and eggs. But it's not because they're over-consuming. And as I said, it's because they really need some animal source foods to give them a nutritious diet. But we know we've got to grapple with some challenges as well. It's about producing enough to meet that demand. It's about addressing those other multiple development dimensions that animals currently touch on. But we've also got to address the harms that could come about if we're haphazard, random, about how we respond to that demand. We know about the environmental harms of animal agriculture. The human health harms are all too prevalent as well. So we need to bundle these things together, how to respond to demand, how to address development, and how to mitigate harms, all at the same time. That's, I think, one of the challenges, and why we need the sorts of innovations to foster a positive transition as we move forward. Let me stop there, Sean, and let others have a go. I know we'll be back round.
No, thank you. That's incredibly useful. And I do want to pass it to Mike and then Ken to build on that. But again, and I will hone in particularly on the nutrition of infants and young children in that critical 6 to 23 month age period where breast milk alone is not enough. It continues to be important. And if you look across low and middle income countries, only 19%, so those vulnerable infants and young kids are getting a minimum acceptable diet. And part of that is inadequate access to animal source foods, just to put it in a very stark understanding. But Mike, if you would like to build on a few of the points that Shirley was making, and then Ken, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. I was very fortunate to spend the bulk of my summer and into the fall traveling around the world, mostly in the developing world, places like Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America. And, when you visit these countries and you're visiting with farmers, on location, you get a much better perspective on the challenges that they encounter, especially relative to the Western world and the United States in particular. Building on your comments just now, Sean, I think one of the things that you realize is that, a single glass of milk and one egg, per day for children growing up in some of these regions can make a massive difference on early childhood development and the quality of life for the citizens in these countries. And then in places like Sub-Saharan Africa, where, I spent some time in Uganda this summer, the countries that are participating in our Alpha initiative, which is the African Livestock Health and Productivity Advancement Initiative that we are partnering with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Those 4 countries, Uganda, Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Tanzania, in those 4 countries alone, you've got basically around 600 million people whose livelihoods depend in some form or fashion on agriculture and animal production. So it's not just about providing a caloric dense source of nutrition, but it's also their very livelihoods are dependent upon animal agriculture, and the commitment to keeping those animals healthy is going to be critical for the future of that farming system, which is based on the smallholder farm, not the big factory farms that we're used to in the Western world.
Thank you so much. And, I think in the background discussions, Ken, I was very, having grown up in a farm belt myself, I just was struck by your observations of a smallholder farmer here in the U.S. and what the importance. So we'd like to hear some of your reflections of the importance of animal source food production for both livelihoods and nutrition.
Yeah, I don't know where to start, really. I came to recognizing the issues with nutrition 15 years ago, more closely than I ever had before, when I was elected the president of our local Michigan co-op here, Dairy Producers, MMPA. And a person at the food bank in Lansing, which is the capital of Michigan, saw that news release and just thought maybe I needed an education. And she was right. I got made a very good close contacts with the food bank, started understanding the issues of nutrition in this country alone. It's a challenge. I mean, as a result of the pandemic, our Governor Whitmer, created a food security council, which I sit on, and again, learn more about the challenges of getting good nutrition to people and actually getting animal nutrition, milk, meat, eggs, to that segment of the population in this country, which we have all kinds of resources, is not a simple process. So transferring that basic knowledge that I have in this country, in this state, to the world, and understanding the challenges of getting good nutrition to people across the globe is a huge challenge. It's going to require cooperation with a lot of people. And that just leads me up to my point that we have made some great strides in this country along the areas of providing nutrition and doing it in a safe and profitable manner for most all farms and most all people. I know that a lot of the people we're trying to help across the globe don't have the resources we have in this country, but I think a lot of the procedures that we have implemented in this country on all size farms can be transferred to some degree to farmers across the globe to help feed themselves and their populations a more nutritious diet. I'm a firm believer in animal agriculture. It's a challenging job. It's a year-round job, but the benefits I see from the nutrition that we produce, I still take a great deal of pride in it today, and I'm very happy to be a part of the organization. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I do think, having been tangentially observing at least the White House Conference on Nutrition, Hunger, Nutrition, and Health, last month, the first one in 50 years. And it really is striking how, while the manifestations of some of the nutrition challenges might be different here in the US than they are in low and middle income countries, many of the structural issues are so similar. And I think, and it's not surprising, nutrition is really the great unifier of us as humanity across the globe. I'm going to come back to you, Ken, because I think, and Shirley, you laid it out, and this panel is obviously demonstrated, animal source foods incredibly important for human nutrition and human livelihoods, but there can be harm. And we do know that the world has made global commitments, for example, to reduce methane emissions and eliminate deforestation. And I'd like to talk about some of the ways that animal source food production, that mitigation of reducing the harm is taking place. And Ken, if you could perhaps share with us, start with you with some of the strategies for reducing the environmental impacts or any harm that's done by production of animal source foods. And then I'll move to Mike and to Shirley.
Sure. Well, in the dairy industry, we usually start with 1944, because that's when we reached the peak in the number of cows in this country, providing milk for the population. And from the time period of 1944 to 2007, the dairy industry reduced the amount of land to produce a gallon of milk by 90%. We reduced the amount of water used to produce that gallon of milk by 65%. And we reduced our carbon footprint significantly. And it didn't stop in 2007. 2007 was a turning point for our industry. We were the first major commodity group in the United States that did a life cycle assessment. And that's where we've got the numbers comparing 1944 to 2007. And we didn't stop there. The dairy industry made a commitment to move forward. And we actually have a commitment today to reach net zero on greenhouse gases by 2050. But in the next 10-year period from 2000 to 2007 to 2017, we actually reduced the amount of land required by another 30%, I think. We reduced the carbon footprint by 19%, and we reduced the amount of water we use significantly. I mention all this because it kind of, in my mind, it goes hand in hand. Reducing the carbon footprint, which is a challenge that we all recognize today, but there is a financial reward for the producer, because in most instances, when you reduce your carbon footprint, you find a more efficient way to produce the product. So it kind of goes hand in hand to me. And I think there's been a revelation in the producer industry when they recognize that, well, wait a minute, this doesn't sound all bad to me. Of course, we still need more research. We still need some fine points polished off. But I think that the industry as a whole is tuned in to, well, I know we are, to produce food more sustainably. I think there can be problems. I know there can be. There can be bad actors. There can be environmental challenges from livestock production. But those are challenges that can be met and can be controlled. And again, I'm just repeating myself, but I think our industry has stepped up to the plate. We've accepted the challenge. We are working not just among ourselves in the production side of it, but we're working with our corporate partners who process our meat and milk and eggs, and coming up with good solutions to some challenging issues. I think I can stop right there, Sean.
Thanks for that, Ken. And in fact, to me, that was a burst of optimism I needed, certainly after we started off the discussion with some of the challenges we're facing. I may come back to you, build on one of your initial points of some of those innovations and changes you're seeing here in the US that may be applicable in low and middle income countries. But before I do that, I'm going to turn to Shirley to also share some of your, I guess, experiences of how, while addressing the increased need for animal source food production, you're also working on mitigating the potential harm. And then Mike, I'll tee up the same question for you.
Thanks, Sean. And it's actually the same recipe, if you like, in terms of what Ken just described, of that increased efficiency, which actually came from better genetics, better feeds, and better health. So you feed the animals well, you make sure they don't die of diseases, and I know Mike will talk about that, and you've got the right breeds in the right environment. And when you bundle those together, you can make huge gains in productivity. But of course, doing that in lower middle income countries, where the current production that's supplying the milk and meat across these areas is coming from smallholder farmers, farms less than 20 hectares that are working in a very integrated way, crops and animals being raised, codependent, if you like, on each other in a circular bioeconomy. So we have to bring, yes, research solutions to address those different technical challenges, but they've got to work in the environment and in the circumstance that the farmers are currently in. And that means that there is a huge potential for, you can almost call it a triple win, because you're going to reduce the carbon footprint of the animals. If you increase the productivity, you get a lower carbon footprint per unit of meat or unit of milk when you increase the productivity. If you increase the productivity, the farmer's happy. They've got more product to sell. And you're starting to address this challenge of demand at the same time. And we're starting to see that in some of the value chains we've been working in here in Kenya, in Tanzania. We've been working in the pork value chain, even in places like Uganda as well, trying to bring together these different technical pieces tailored to the local circumstances, but supporting them with the right input mechanisms and making sure that there's good output markets. And perhaps we get into the whole issue of markets and food safety later. But on the production side, absolutely, when we bundle those things together and make sure that the technologies are adapted to the circumstances locally, we can make big strides and have potentially triple wins.
Yeah, and who can not be for a triple win, right? I think this is pretty exciting. Mike, asking you to build on that, and then I'm going to come back to you with the next question for the panel.
Okay, thanks, Sean. And look, as the veterinarian, it shouldn't be any surprise that my default answer here is going to focus on the importance of animal health. And the bottom line is healthier animals are more efficient, period. I was very struck, again, in my experiences in Africa very recently, that in some of these farms, before we started our educational program, which ultimately we ended up educating about 26,000 veterinarians, paraprofessionals, and farmers, about a third of whom were women. And prior to that educational process, it wasn't unusual for these small farms to experience 50% death loss, especially in their poultry flocks. Many of these flocks had endemic disease that could easily be prevented by vaccine. And so we provided the vaccine at no cost for a period of time, but we also helped educate them that even when they're buying vaccine for their flocks, it's ultimately more cost efficient for them to vaccinate their flocks and avoid disease altogether versus the 50% death loss that they were experiencing. That's not good for anybody. It's not good for the environment. It's not good for them economically. It's not good in terms of the quality of and safety of the meat, food, and eggs that are produced by these flocks. So I think there's a great deal to be learned, and given the fact that smallholder farms still make up a strong proportion of the total livestock that are raised around the world, that educational commitment needs to continue. But focusing on health, preventing disease through vaccines, improving the genetic foundation of herds and flocks, these are critical areas that can have a huge impact on the efficiency of the herd, the overall impact on the environment, and obviously the impact on the smallholder farm.
Thanks. And I'm going to push a bit more because as we expected, because I did want to dig into these innovations around animal health. I mean, in the prep for this preparations for this panel, I was getting all these tidbits about animal health, but if you could maybe build a bit more on some of these innovations in delivery of animal health services that you talked about. I found them very exciting. And particularly about the training, the training methods, et cetera.
Right.
How do you make sure these services are getting to the smallholder farmers?
Yeah, I think first of all, at Zoetis, we think of animal care along a continuum. Our ability to provide solutions that prevent disease, detect disease, treat disease, et cetera. And that focus has allowed us to be very innovative in how we produce solutions that can address animal health along that continuum. And then the rest of it is a very strong focus on education. That the company has always been strong with regards to education, especially in the developing world. The demand for this type of education is incredibly strong. The participation was something that we were very pleased with in a relatively short period of time. To be able to educate 26,000 farmers was no small feat. And I think the other challenge that we have is in many of these areas, there's no process that is widely recognized for educating veterinarians and accrediting the education that they go through. And so you have some countries that may have literally hundreds of vet schools, but the quality of the veterinarians that they're graduating can vary tremendously from high to low. And so our focus on trying to even out that level of education and to ensure that the farmers are aware of the latest technologies that can improve the output of the herds that they're responsible for is a big part of what we do. And then, of course, we'll probably talk about this a little bit later on as well. I'm excited about future innovations, the possibilities that we can all but eliminate the use of antibiotics, traditional antibiotics in herd health by focusing on protein, stimulating the immune system, monoclonal antibodies, et cetera, can help us reduce antibiotic use or developing completely different antibiotic technologies that will also ensure that we're doing something that's helpful to the planet by reducing antibiotic resistance. So again, I'll come back to it one last time, Sean, the importance of education and all of us participating in that educational process, especially in the developing world, is going to be critical to improving the health of herds overall, which ultimately is going to feed a lot more people and do it more efficiently than we could have otherwise.
Thanks so much. And Ken, if you could share with us some of your insights about, I guess, the trajectory of animal health and its role here in the U.S.
Well, it's changed dramatically. Today, to go along with what Mike has said, and Zoetis has been a very good partner to work with. It's actually rare on our farm that we use an antibiotic today. What we do use is a lot of vaccines to protect illnesses and the animal care issue. In the dairy industry, I think all the industries are the same way today. We have to meet certain animal care standards, and if we don't meet them, we lose our market. So it's kind of an education and a stick process. If you don't accept the education and do things right, you do lose your market. I stumble over this because I've been in the dairy industry. I got back out of the service in 1968, so I've been in it a long time. And there's always been changes in our industry, but the changes that we've seen in the last 50 years and just in the last 20 years are just outstanding. And the ability and the foresight of the producer side of the industry coming together, working together to make improvements, because today, 50 years ago, it's nobody's business what I do on my farm. Okay, that was the attitude. Today, we recognize it's everybody's business because it's where their food is coming from. And they want to know where their food's coming from, and they want to know that we are treating our animals correctly. That process we've gone through in this country, you can take it to any place in the globe, in a smallholder, dairy farm, pork farm, poultry, and you can use that same method to make great advances. When Mike talks about educating people, one thing we found here in Michigan, Michigan State University started using sample farms, for what lack of a better term, in the dairy industry, to when we got away from the closed up buildings that we thought were good for the animals and took the sides off. Then we put curtains, plastic curtains back over in the wintertime. That was one of the biggest improvements I've seen, actually. It was pretty cheap, it was pretty simple. But one of the biggest challenges for a dairy animal is heat and humidity in the summer months. It can damage reproductive, damage milk production, respiratory diseases. But Michigan State came in, the ag engineering department, and came up with this idea of an open-sided building. They talked a few of us into building buildings like that. We saw how much better it was for the animals. And I don't know if there's a building, dairy barn left in Michigan that doesn't have open sides in the summertime. I'll pass it on to Shirley.
Yeah, thanks, Shirley. And to focus this question specifically on innovations in animal health that you're seeing and have a lot of promise.
Sure. I touch perhaps on what Mike said about the use of antimicrobials, because that's a big issue, but it's a very unknown issue. We know that antimicrobials are used and abused at the moment, but actually understanding that is a big black hole at the moment. People don't really know very much about what's going on in terms of the antimicrobial resistance that may be arising and where the different transmissions might be happening and so on. But there's lots that can be done to alleviate that so that they're not used. Vaccines, yes, it's absolutely one. And the organization I work for, ILRI, is developing vaccines for some of those diseases that are here in lower middle income countries that perhaps are not of such interest to some of the bigger veterinary companies working in other parts of the world. And we can do that in many cases quite, I was going to say easily. Developing a vaccine is not easily, but less complicated because we're in areas where the diseases are endemic. So you don't need the same level of biosafety containment to do the work that you need to do on a vaccine, for example. But I think importantly as well in this space are things like herd health. Just really elevating the management of animals so that they're much healthier as well, of course, tends to reduce the need for antimicrobials. And some of the new things that Mike was talking about, fantastic. How do we tailor those and start to apply them as well? Sean, could I make a couple of comments about the other two productivity dimensions, perhaps examples in that space as well, the genetics and the feed?
Well, that actually feeds into the follow-up question. I was going to start with you of we've talked a lot about innovations in animal health, but I'd actually tease it up perfectly. What are outside of animal health, realizing that, of course, it's all linked to animal health in many ways, but what are some of the other exciting innovations that are going on that really excite you? And then Mike and Ken, I will tee up the same question. I also will note there are at least two questions in the chat box I'm going to try to get to, but if participants want to ask questions, do feel free to put them in the chat box and we'll get to the ones we can. But yes, Shirley, so share with us some of the things that excite you in those other two dimensions.
Okay, so on the feed, I mentioned that most of the animal products, and in fact, almost all the cereal products as well, are coming from these integrated small farms. And in those farms, at least 70% of the animal feed are what we call crop residues. They're the leftovers. You harvest the sorghum, you harvest the maize, and it's the stalks and leaves or whatever is left that's fed to the animal. So we've done a lot of work in how can you improve the quality of those leftovers. of course, the first reaction from the crop breeders was, no, we can't do that because it will compromise the grain yield. So we've been able to show that no, there's enough variation to breed for improved quality without compromising grain yield. And there's very simple ways that you can assess that. You've not got to take all your breeding lines and do a feeding trial. So we can improve the quality of crop residues, which of course means the feed for the animals. And we can look at how they're packaged as well, chop them up, put them in a block, whatever. When you do that, you can actually start to move towards what Ken was describing in terms of efficiency. You can increase the productivity because you're feeding so much better. And now we're looking at new technologies, things like some of the technologies that have been used for biofuel that actually break down all these tough stalks. How could they be used to improve, again, the quality, the digestibility? So there's one in the feeds, a huge opportunity to increase productivity, but without switching to a concentrate-based diet that would, of course, have environmental implications. In the genetic space, our teams have been using mobile phone technologies to gather information about all these many animals spread over hundreds of smallholders. You can't do really good breeding if you've only got 1 or 2 animals on your farm. But if you can collect the data from across hundreds of farms, then you've got an opportunity to start to pick out the best genetics and do some good breeding. And that's what we've been able to do using a mobile phone approach. And now I'm going to link with the health and the nutrition. We've had a study in the west of Kenya where they found that by vaccinating the chickens, so the chickens didn't die, the children got 24% more protein in their diets. And as a result, the children had better height and weight statistics. So starting to address those things together. That's my bit on that.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. Of course, that last example, exactly. And I also, you read my mind when you preempted the question I had about other trade-offs in plant breeding between the ability to actually produce the calories humans are going to eat and then produce what do you call it, the residues that the animals will eat. So it's really encouraging to see you actually those trade-offs can be managed. Mike, I'm going to push you out of your comfort zone of animal health and to see if there's other innovations, or even within animal health, something more you'd like to share with us. But
yeah, mentioned a little while ago, I mentioned our Zoetis continuum of care, this concept of predicting, preventing, detecting, and then treating disease. There's a very good reason why treatment is the last thing mentioned. That's what you have left over when everything else has failed or only been partially successful. So as far as things like antibiotics are concerned, I'm not sure antibiotics are ever going to completely go away, but we've been able to show that being very targeted in the animals that you use antibiotics for, and when you're fairly sophisticated in your approach to targeting, you can avoid the overuse of antibiotics and ensure that antibiotics never enter into the food system that is consumed by our citizens. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is I think, context is super important here as well, because when you talk about some of the regulatory pathways and challenges that we have to deal with, there's what we have to face in the United States and Western Europe, which was built around a system that's primarily concerned about food safety, nutrition overall, in an environment where we're mostly overnourished. Our biggest nutritional challenge in the United States is probably obesity. It's not undernourishment, it's overconsumption, and what that leads to, including diabetes, et cetera. When you get to the underdeveloped world, it's starvation that we're worried about. It's the lack of resources. It's the lack of appropriate food. It's undernourishment. And that's a very, very different point of view. And unfortunately, sometimes the regulatory challenges that companies like mine face outside of the US and Western Europe are curtailing our ability to get these new innovations at a reasonable price into the hands of the smallholder farmers that can use them. And I think at some point, collectively, we're going to have to address this need for stronger regulatory harmonization around the world so we can get these products where they're desperately needed, especially in a world that's post-pandemic. And we've all had very real experiences with what happens when people encroach on animal environments, and we're not doing as good a job as we should be monitoring for disease and zoonotic spread.
Thank you for that. And I want to come back to some of the points you made, but Ken, I also, and you were speaking to a lot of the changes you've observed, but then also how you think many of them are applicable to low and middle income countries. And maybe if you could share some of the innovations that you've seen that you think have particular promise beyond the US.
Well, you know, animal care and animal nutrition may be the two biggest ones. They've made a tremendous difference on the productivity of the herd in the United States. I know that. Just the use and reuse of nutrients in this country, I think, is applicable to the smallholder farms, and maybe they're already doing it. But the cow doesn't just produce meat and milk. She also has the byproduct, the manure, that should be, if it's collected and handled right, goes a long ways to growing the crop for next year's feed for that same cow. If smallholder farms in some of the underdeveloped countries are the same as we were in this country, they're not giving those nutrients the value that they deserve. That's one thing that's been brought home to me from what starts with my dad, actually, is manure was never called a waste product on our farm. We always knew it had nutritional value for the corn crop or whatever crop was going to be planted in that field. So we didn't haul the manure to the closest field to the barn. We hauled it to where the field that needed it. And we've continued to do that, my brother and I. Kind of the simple things like that, I think, can be easily transferred to any place on the globe. I know I'm stumbling because I've never faced the same challenges as some of those people do. And one that I guess made me really stop and think was several years ago. I had a dairy farmer from Costa Rica visiting. Some people from Michigan State brought him out to look at our farm and get ideas about how he could run his farm back in Costa Rica. And we were talking, and I was talking about how simple it was to do some of these things. And he says, wait a minute, you got to remember that I don't know from one day to the next if I'm going to have electricity the next day. So whenever I try to start, like, I know what I'm talking about and say, well, we did it here, you can do it there, I'm not familiar with their challenges. So I'm looking for the simplest answer to your question. And that's why I say I think it starts with animal care and proper use of the manure from those animals to feed the next year's corn crop.
Yeah, and I may actually pass that over to Shirley of some of the examples from the ILRI perspective of use of animal manure as an essential part of farming of these integrated smallholder farms.
Yeah.
So I'm going off script a bit as the moderator, but I have that license.
I was nearly going to jump in and say, let me say something.
Okay, well,
so it's okay.
We read each other's mind then. Perfect. Go ahead, please.
Yeah. As I said, there's well over half a billion of these integrated small farms. And our estimates are that there's probably 70% or so of the milk, meat, and eggs in at least Africa and Asia are coming from those farms. But also half of the cereals, the staple cereals. So when we talk about food and nutrition security, these are the engines. And they're operating in that integrated way, Ken, that you described, because those cereals cannot be produced unless the animals are in the system. Because of the manure, often because of traction or draft for plowing, but also because of income. It's very often the case that a farmer will sell perhaps a small animal or something in order to buy the seeds or the fertilizer they need, and to buy them in time when the rain comes, so that they can get them in the ground and produce the crops. So they're quite well integrated. Of course, the challenge is that they're not producing a level that's going to respond to the demand that we talked about earlier. So where you are, you've got the high levels of productivity, the sophisticated technology, let's say, that's elevated that production. In some cases, the production's been separated. You've got feed produced somewhere and animals produced somewhere else. So you may, in some cases, have lost the integration. So you've got the transformation, but without the integration, I like to say. Where we've got the integration, but we don't yet have the full transformation. So we've got sort of almost contrasting pieces. And I don't know if anybody's aware of, in 1999, there was a publication called the Livestock Revolution that predicted this demand that we're seeing now. And I like to say, we can't meet revolution with evolution. We need really new technologies. We need the latest technologies, but we have to adapt them and apply them in context. So increasingly, we're trying to partner with developed country organizations. We've got a really good partnership with an organization in Scotland that does high-end genetics and genomics. And then we're trying to provide genetics and genomics in our labs, but the interface to the field as well. So there's to start to move those technologies, but also to transfer them on the way as well.
Thank you so much. I'm going to look into the chat, and there are a couple of questions I'd like to start responding to. One of them, it goes back to actually where we started the conversation. And Peter, I'm sorry, I can't read the last name from the chat, says that speakers have rightly emphasized the nutritional value of animal source foods. However, there's a large contingent arguing that promotion of animal source foods is not desirable, and we should instead promote plant-based nutrition sources, which are considered to be more climate friendly and better for overall health. How do you respond to this argument from a low and middle income country perspective? So I'm actually going to step out of my role as moderator and start an answer, but then as all of you want to chime in here, I think that, obviously plant source, including plant source, improving access to protein sources from plants is part of improving the diets overall. That being said, to meet the nutrient requirements, particularly of pregnant and lactating moms and infants and young kids, it's extremely difficult to do that without some animal source foods. And the quantities we're talking about to meet those is really small. And I think often we make this equation, animal source foods equal protein. In fact, animal source foods are almost magical from a nutritional perspective because they're providing many of the essential nutrients, micronutrients, essential fatty acids, and even the protein quality. So I don't think, to me, it should be, and this is where I think we need more nuance about context matters. What are the gaps in people's diets where? And certainly in low and middle income countries, there are enormous gaps in access to these nutrient-dense animal source foods. And I think, so the question is, how do you optimize nutrients from plant sources as well as optimize the nutrients from animal sources? But I don't know, Mike, Shirley, Ken, if you want to build on my response, if I've misread the response. But I think, Shirley, you framed it well of we're not at all dismissive of the potential harms. Is how do you meet the animal source food requirements, both for nutrition and livelihoods, while at the same time mitigating all the potential harm? Shirley, I don't know if you want to build on that, or Mike or Ken.
Yeah, I mean, the plant protein issue often comes up, and there's many angles you can take. If we're going to feed 10 billion people in the next few decades, we need all the solutions, but we don't need all of the solutions in all of the places. As Sean has said, the context really matters. All of us aspire to nutritious, healthy, sustainable diets. But for some of us, that might mean eating less meat, milk, eggs. It may mean that we have a choice and we can decide not to eat those products, and we can go to the pharmacy and buy supplements. But for many, many people, billions around the world, they don't have that choice. And at the moment, increasing a little bit of meat or milk or egg in the diet would make a huge difference to growth, to cognitive ability, and thus to how the kids are going to learn in school. And what does that mean for future economic development, even perhaps? I often like to say it this way: if you're sitting in UK or US or wherever it might be, you can choose to exclude meat from your diet, and you might do it for the benefit of your health. A mother in India might choose to give her child a glass of milk every day, and she's doing it for the same reason, for the benefit of health. But it looks extremely different.
Yes.
I think, Sean, I think you and Shirley summarized it really, really well. And obviously, I think the word of the day is context.
Yeah.
And that's everything when it comes to tackling this particular topic. The nutritional density of animal sourced food is something that has to be heavily weighed, especially, as Shirley pointed out, we're looking at a world that's going to be exceptionally crowded. In 2030, 2050, it's now already 8 billion people. The population of the world has doubled since I graduated from high school. How are we going to feed all of those people? And to imagine a world where we can do that without animal source protein is beyond my capacity, especially when you consider the micronutrients, the nutritional density and quality overall of animal source protein collectively.
I would just like to add that I don't think people realize that it's estimated that a third of the diet of the dairy cows in this country are byproducts that, if not fed to cows, because they're a ruminant, they can use the byproducts. A lot of them would go to landfills. And that's where we gained a lot of our efficiency. And I think a lot of people miss that. They think that all the cropland that we're using, that all of the feed that's going into the cow is coming from virgin cropland, and it isn't. A lot of it is byproduct.
You can say that about land in other situations as well, and even if you look at the dry matter that's consumed by animals kind of all over the world, only 14% of that could be eaten by people. The rest is, as you say, it's byproducts.
Yeah.
And I think just to share with the audience, when we were even preparing for this webinar, this seminar, I think the theme of the day is you need to bring nuance into this discussion. So, well, yes, certainly certain populations reducing consumption of animal source foods is the right thing to do for their own health and planetary boundaries. Other parts of the population, in fact, animal source foods are so deficient in diets. And those are also the parts of the world that have contributed almost nothing, if anything at all, to the current climate crisis. There is a question in the chat also specifically to you, Shirley, about what ILRI is doing to encourage livestock producers in developing countries to adopt prescribed grazing practices that are considered to be more climate smart. I think you actually brought up two parts of that answer already. I was fascinated by how much of the animal fodder is actually coming from crops, and then how some land, that's the best way to use it is grazing. But be interested in anything you had to add on that.
Yeah, I think about 54% of the world's terrestrial surface is rangelands, and something like 80% of that is being used, for animal production, but it couldn't be used for anything else. So the fact that animals are producing protein on that land is quite something, and it couldn't be used to grow crops. In terms of what ILRI is doing, if we talk about managing rangelands, we do quite a lot of work, especially in Tanzania, really, on participatory range management, because quite often the challenges are around the people side of things, if you like. And it's about how you get communities who might be settled and those who might be nomadic to better engage and work together and come to common understandings and common ways of managing their grazing lands. I think the pastoral communities are incredible environmental stewards, but sometimes the pressures on them and their lands for different reasons force them to look like not such good environmental stewards. So anything we can do to support their environmental stewardship will be good for the lands that they manage, for the biodiversity, for carbon sequestration, and so on. I suppose the only other thing I would like to say in that context is that we need to get really good at targeting. We don't want to say all rangelands everywhere or pastoral lands should be producing meat or milk, and we should have a lot of offtake. In some cases, that can really work if we manage the grazing well. But in other cases, maybe we should focus more on the environmental stewardship side of things and look at providing incentives for that.
No, and that comes, I think, back to a theme throughout this: context matters. And how do we get in our support and our work that more disaggregated understanding of that context, but also, and I'm going to come back to this, of in fact, smallholder farmers across the world are powerhouses of innovation. And how do we make sure we're understanding the innovations, all the traditional stewardship, as you had said, Shirley, that's already occurring, and how do we not displace that but support that? I actually wanted to do a round, and we've started on this a bit, of what is your favorite misperception, and you're allowed to have several if you would like, around animal source foods that you would like to take this opportunity to debunk. If there's one thing that, or one or two things where you think that there's just a misperception about them, I think we sort of debunked one of them right now, that all the nutrient requirements can be met by plant sources. And I think there's a strong argument that plant sources can help a lot, but to totally substitute for the nutrient value of animal source foods is extremely difficult. Any other? So I don't know, do you want, who would like to take the first crack at debunking something? Mike, I'm actually going to pass it to you because you're sitting there with a smile, look like you have something on top of mind.
I was thinking, don't pick me, don't pick me, don't pick me.
Okay,
No,
you drew attention to yourself.
Yeah, I think, especially in talking with the lay public, let's say, it's there's this perception that farming and livestock farming is inherently inefficient in some way, and they equate that lack of efficiency with climate harm, et cetera. And it's actually the reverse being true. And even in the underdeveloped countries, the old saying of necessity is the mother of invention. What I see in these smallholder farms is practically miraculous. A lot of the high tech stuff that's behind the scenes and in big US production facilities is right there in front of your face in these smallholder farms, where nothing, absolutely nothing, goes to waste. They grow their own fruit, they grow their own grains. Everything that isn't edible by humans is edible by the pigs and the dairy cows. All the manure is collected into bunkers that is then turned into biogas. And since most of these facilities don't have consistent electricity, they have no means for heating water, heating food. the ability to create their own biogas that goes into heating food and giving hot water for bathing their children, et cetera. It's amazing what goes on behind the scenes with a lot of these little farms where just absolutely nothing goes to waste. There's no such thing as the big trash bag that goes out on the curb, one day a week and gets hauled off to some landfill facility. Everything is utilized on these farms.
Thanks so much. Ken, I'm going to pass it to you because if I go clockwise, you're next to my screen.
I think, I don't know if it's the biggest on the consumer side. I don't think people realize how nutrient dense a dairy product is. On the other side of it, I also think that the consumers don't understand the care and the regulatory issues that are faced with milk production, that we have to meet some very strict standards to make sure we are producing, and we want to do it, but we make sure we are producing a wholesome, high quality product for the consumers. I also, I'll throw one more in there. Sometimes technology gets a bad score by consumers. The new technology, for example, that we use on the farm that are totally harmless, that it makes for a better product, makes for a safer produced product. I think I'll quit with that and quit while I'm ahead.
Thanks for those. Shirley?
Well, I think it's the two things that we've kind of been touching on, that animal source foods are bad for you. No. And if we keep raising animals for food, we're going to destroy the planet. In both cases, that's, again, it's about context. It's not the truth of all over the world. It's things we have to address. Absolutely. We've got to do better with environmental sustainability across all sectors, not just animal agriculture. And as we've been saying, animal products are really not just good for you, but essential in many cases. And if you look at that issue of nutrient density, I was looking earlier today, I think it's, the combination of nutrients in animal foods is such that you can eat far, far less. And that matters hugely for small children because they can't eat a lot. They couldn't eat 10 kilos of carrots, which is what you might have to eat to get enough vitamin A or whatever it might be, compared to a small piece of animal product or so. So I think that the need to get nuance and to move away from what has almost become a polarized discussion. It's almost become a binary equation, get rid of the animals or keep the animals. And that's not really what it is. And it's not really helpful when it comes over like that. And I'm sure for general public, it gets incredibly confusing when they hear that some of these potentially conflicting sounding messages.
No, thanks for that, Shirley, because I do think this is part of this discussion of how does one depolarize this discussion, bring more of the evidence base. We're not being dismissive of any of the challenges, but also recognizing the needs. And then to your point, and it's incredibly important and not something that people perhaps have an immediate grasp of, nutrient density is so essential, particularly for infants and young kids, because here at that period from 6 to 23 months, when breast milk alone is not enough, the guts are really tiny. So if we're filling kids with maize meal or cassava meal, that guts, it will satiate, but not give nutrients. And it's not like, as you said, those tiny little guts can absorb massive quantities to extract the nutrients that are needed. And then similarly, the level of nutrient requirements during pregnancy and lactation are so much higher. And so particularly for those age groups, that nutrient density and the quality of those nutrients is so essential to meet those requirements. There are a couple of questions that are here. One actually, I think I'm going to go directly. Well, first of all, the one from Dilip Bhandari, very important. Smallholder livestock producers are the powerhouse, but they have difficulty in accessing market, and they are not getting fair share of the profit from the livestock products. What should be done to address this issue? I think actually all three of you will have a perspective of that, of how do you actually make sure that smallholder farmers who are producing animal source foods are getting their fair share and getting access to markets. Maybe Ken, I'm going to actually start with you, then pass it to Mike and then Shirley.
I will answer that very affirmatively because we faced the same issue in this country a century ago. Form cooperatives among the farmers, dairy cooperatives, beef cooperatives. Put your goods in one basket and market them together. It's the only way you're going to get the market clout that you need to and get the prices that you deserve.
Again, I was going to say something very similar, Sean. The co-ops are incredibly important, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. That has been a huge advantage, not just from a competitive pricing standpoint, but it also makes it a lot easier for companies like mine to educate. You know, we're starting at the co-op level first, and then that information can trickle down from there.
Yeah, I think I'd say something similar. I don't know if you call them all cooperatives, but it's certainly a way of bringing together not just producers, but other actors on the value chain and getting them much more connected, much more working together, addressing things like input and output supply markets and so on, and the education part, as Mike mentioned. So it's some form or other of collective integrated action. It's professionalizing what are quite, at times at the moment, chaotic value chains and starting to raise their level of business acumen, of professionalism, and so on.
And so Shirley, you're saying even if they're not formal cooperatives, there are ways to help structure smallholder farmers. Yeah.
Quite a while ago, we had some work in I think it was Mozambique, where we, just by bringing together the people who were producing and the people who were in the markets, marketing, and having weighing scales involved in the equation. This was for small ruminants, for goats, I think. Suddenly the playing field became much more even, and they started working much better together. It wasn't an us and them, and well, you've never got any animals, so we're not coming to you again, or when you buy our animals, that you don't sell them at a good price, and all the rest of it. So it was just by finding ways to bring people together and help them to understand and work together was almost transformative in that case, I could say.
Yeah, and I'll actually add a story just because I visited Senegal just last month, and from USAID, one of our Feed the Future programs, which is called Kaolor, which is actually completely focused on strengthening women's groups in villages. So this is something these are traditional structures. So it's not like the program invented, but it was really what's already there. And then how do you continue to strengthen that and even make it more formal? And the impacts on ability to negotiate prices, to negotiate access to resources was just incredibly transformative. And the changes in women's empowerment indicators and nutrition indicators are really quite striking. So I do think that harnessing the collective voice, be it through cooperatives being perhaps the most formal way to do that, but other mechanisms seems to be a common theme in responding to this. This is a more specialized. Yes, go ahead.
Can I come in? Your comment on the women reminded me as well. This was now several decades ago, I guess. I was working in not too far from Senegal, on the edges, almost on the edges of the Sahel. And we were working on this crop residue aspect that I mentioned. How could you improve the crop residues, feed them to the sheep in that area and improve things? And we'd been working largely with the men because of the cultural environment we were in. But one day we went and the women called out, what about us? You haven't done anything for us. So we said, okay, we'll meet with you and learn. Now, we were not allowed, even as two women at that time, we were not allowed to meet with the women without the men present. But we met, we helped them to benefit from the same kinds of technology. And as that started to happen, they formed their own collective groups and in turn became quite empowered as well, because they were then able, when we went with visitors, we would see what the women's group was doing and what the men's group was doing, even when we went with male visitors. So there was quite a transformation, even culturally, through some of these kinds of things.
Right. And I actually may come back to this question because, and I think all of you mentioned at the get-go about the importance of animal source foods to livelihoods, but I think it may also not be well understood about how much of animal source food production is actually run by women and how it's particularly critical for women's livelihoods, which has this truly transformative effect. So I'm going to park that if people want to opine on that, because I do think that's probably an aspect here that's not come forward as strongly as it could. But there's one other question here in the chat, I thought, and this is pretty, I think, specific probably to Ilri. It was related to, so let me read the second half. Improved grasses with deep root systems is an option not explored enough in cattle systems. So I guess to me, let me sort of frame the question of what research is going in with, I'm familiar a lot with plant breeding, that's breeding plants for animal, for consumption by humans, but maybe any insights of research that's going on to improve fodder, plants for animal fodder.
A lot of work on forages by Ilri to some extent, also by our sister center, CIAT, a member of the Alliance, which is based in Colombia. Both of us have really big collections of forage materials from all over the world, which have been tried and tested, some of them being rolled out in different places. I think there's a big challenge in the area of forages at the moment in terms of seed production. And we do have some small projects ongoing in Ethiopia, trying to bring private sector into that as well, and some other countries to try and change that so that you can get forage material. Another challenge is, how do you pick out the best ones among these thousands and thousands of different varieties and so on. And one of the things we're doing is using new molecular techniques, genomics, to start to pick out the best ones among those. Here in Kenya, we've done a lot of work with bracharia grass, which is proving to be extremely successful for dairy farmers in particular. And so that's also going really well. And that's in addition to the work with the crop residues that I've already mentioned. I'm not sure if I've answered, but hopefully that was.
No, I think that's very useful. I didn't mean, Mike and Ken, to exclude you from that question, but if you want to jump in, feel free to, but it felt a bit targeted towards the agricultural research centers.
Yeah, I think Shirley addressed it very well. I would just add to it that, especially at Zoetis, our goal is to work with livestock producers to raise healthy animals, no matter what feeding system that they're using. The goal is to produce a healthy animal, and there's a variety of ways to do that with different feeding systems.
And what we see in this country is that plant breeders are constantly improving corn that's used for silage, and also alfalfa and other forage crops to make them more efficient, more digestible.
Excellent. Again, I think it feeds into this overarching theme of how much context matters. Now, we are coming up, we're going to close in less than 15 minutes. If there are any additional questions from the audience, feel free to.
Sean, could we touch on the issue of the women that you parked?
Right,
just
yeah,
now?
so yeah, no, I actually wanted to come back to that because, and maybe if you could start us off, Shirley, on responding to that. I'm not sure I framed the question correctly, but in my, I think the evidence shows, and depends, again, context, but often animal source foods are very much, or women are central to that, those value chains. And maybe I will share a couple of anecdotes of my own, but Shirley, like to kick that off. And also, Mike, I was very interested in your story about some of these para-veterinary services and how much of the workforce is women, et cetera. So I'd like to get some insights to that, but Shirley, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, we know that certainly in rural areas, in lower middle income regions, probably 2/3 of the livestock are in the hands of women. They're helping to raise them or look after them. So women are essential for the livestock and raising them. In many situations as well, a woman might be able to own an animal, but she can't have, say, a title deed. So it's a real important asset as well that helps to empower women in that sense too. And then, as you said, women are often the ones in the household who are responsible for making decisions about nutrition. So it's also really important that we find ways to engage with women that are quite intentional, making sure they have access to knowledge and information and training and so on, so that their role in raising animals, in often processing, particularly milk and dairy products in many parts of the world, animal source foods, are really strengthened and capitalized on, as it were. Both sides lose out if we don't pay attention to this.
Absolutely. Mike?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier that in the Alpha Initiative, about 1/3 of the participants were women. And then when you see this at work, I was really struck by the fact that not only were there a lot of women in the livestock industries there on smallholder farms, but more often than not, they were among the most innovative farms, the ones that were run by women. They were leaning into new technologies, among the first to vaccinate flocks and things of that nature. So it was frankly fairly disturbing to hear how backward some of these environments still are for women. A woman, in one particular woman who was exceptionally successful as a farmer, had her initial farm taken away from her by a little brother. She basically took over the family farm, improved it dramatically, improved its productivity and efficiency using the same land space. But then a sibling who was male took that farm away from her, and she had really no legal recourse, but quickly just reestablished her own farm using her own animals. And as Shirley mentioned, the law tends to be a little more flexible in these countries in terms of a woman's ability to own animals. But I was struck by the number of additional obstacles that women have to clear in order to be successful as farmers, but their persistence in doing so and their success in doing so was remarkable.
Thank you. Yeah, and I do think, it's striking how, as you laid out, Shirley, we know that, to me, there is this true magic of when women are already absolute backbones of the food production system, and often that involves animal source foods. When you're giving them better access to the technologies, the resources, and better control over that, it has transformation, and certainly that transformation includes improving nutritional outcomes of children and the whole family. So it is, I think, one of the most magical solutions, if you will, and their role or their interface between the role of women in animal source food production is so essential. I want to start closing up, but before I do, I know there's one question about the animal production in the US. I don't know, Ken, if you can see that in the chat box about if you want to try to take a read of that. It's related to not including concentrated animal feeding operations. When you cite statistics on efficiency, you're not including these industries. I don't know if you want to respond to that.
Yeah, definitely including them. We're including everybody. We're talking about the U.S. dairy herd. And actually, what we refer to as CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations, are the organizations that are under the most strict rules for environment for everything. So yes, they are definitely included. Mitigating some of the greenhouse gas issues with the larger farms is more costly than it is with the smaller farms, small and medium-sized farms. They do have to go through, they do have to make more bigger investments, but then there is economy of size, and they're more able to pay for it. But definitely they are included. And one thing I want to add here, I don't think I've been completely clear about it, is the strides that the dairy industry has taken in this country to reduce their greenhouse gases is astounding. As I said, we did that life cycle analysis back in 2007, and the changes we made from 44 to 2007 were huge, but that's a lot of years. But then that 10-year period from 7 to 17, we continue to see the changes, and we've pledged to meet net zero by 2050, and I'll guarantee you we will be there as an industry. That doesn't mean every individual farm will be, but the total milk supply will be at net zero by 2050 or before. The changes are coming at warp speed today.
Thank you.
Maybe if I put my other hat of chair of the Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock, we have private sector associations who are members. And no matter where, if it's eggs or meat or dairy or whatever, all are committing to sustainability. And as Ken says, making good strides in that direction. So often I hear them talk about some of the things that are happening and using sustainability metrics and so on. And I think we're keeping this a bit of a secret and people are not aware of it. Mm-hmm. So maybe there's a communication challenge perhaps there as well.
So my job is to try to wrap up this session, and then I want to pass it back to Katie from the Farm Journal Foundation for any final remarks. But what I'm taking away from this, to me, this has been personally a very encouraging discussion that, in fact, there is a pathway or multiple pathways forward of both leveraging the role of animal source foods in meeting the nutrient requirements and improving livelihoods, and doing it in a way that actually can increasingly reduce its impacts on the environment and make them more sustainable. In this, and that's why I say pathways, context matters immensely. Obviously, for some populations, for individual health and global public health, reduction of animal source food consumption is part of that. Improving consumption of plant source foods is part of that. But animal source foods will continue to play a very important role both in nutrition and livelihoods. And there's an immense amount of innovation going on at all levels to work forward in a way that's meeting those needs in a way that's respectful of our needs to live on this planet and use this planet to feed us. So this has been incredibly exciting to hear this discussion, a rich discussion among the panelists. With that, Katie, I would like to pass it back over to you for any last closing words. And before I do that, though, just a huge thanks to the panelists, to the Farm Journal Foundation, and to everybody attended today. Katie, over to you.
Thank you, Sean, and thanks also to Ken, Mike, and Shirley. And thanks to all of you for tuning in today. I believe I predicted a robust discussion at the front end, and I'm pleased to say this even beat my lofty expectations. So I really just appreciate everyone's perspective here, and that we were able to have some robust discussion as well from the audience and the questions that were asked. And we at Farm Journal Foundation, I think, share that view of optimism that you expressed, Sean. I think that's the impatient optimist brand of working at the Gates Foundation runs through my veins as well. And so just want to again say thank you to everyone and really appreciate this. And I'm sure we'll continue to be able to have similar robust conversations in the future about this topic and other related topics to global food security and the importance of innovation in that conversation. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.